Therapy dudes, take away your stress, put you in a good mood. If you had them over, they would eat up all your food. It's time for therapy dudes.
Uh-oh. Andre,
What's going
welcome to
on?
paradise.
Uh-oh.
Everybody's anxious. We are therapy dudes, Andre Karkamas and Dan Fox, talking about anxiety today. I'd like to shout out our sponsor, BoulderPsychologicalServices.com. Check out their website for all your therapy needs. The next 4 weeks, we're going to be focused on anxiety, why it
Oh,
happens, how it happens, skills and techniques you can use to manage it, the neuroscience that we now understand behind it, and also just our own kind of personal journey working with all the theoretical tools that we're talking about. Today, we're going to get into some of the neuroscience. How you doing, Andre?
I'm good. A little anxious about this topic, to be honest.
A little anxious.
Anxiety sucks. I think it's the worst. Um,
Anxiety
it
sucks.
just sucks. Uh,
Yeah, I was reading this article yesterday that it came out in the Science Journal, and it was like, here's this person's great insight into how to like not overthink things as you go to bed. And it was, another sort of tool where I found it to be like what was lacking in that article for me was a conceptual explanation of why all this stuff would work and what's going on in the brain that makes us overthink at night. That's what we're going to get into today. But the suggestion was to just take a word like piano and then just free associate with like thoughts and visualizations that you have about a piano and like the movie The Piano, or a time you've seen somebody play the piano, and just to kind of flash on that stuff. And when you run out of things to flash on, you just start going through the letters of the word piano and be like, P. Think of all the words that you know that begin with P. Be like, okay, um, paradise. And then it's like, all right, what places feel like
sounds
paradise?
awful.
So it just kind of like it gives your brain a
Something
script,
to
a little
focus on.
task to do, so it doesn't switch gears and go into this kind of anxious, overthinking place as you're going to sleep, right? This was a specific technique for sleep.
Hmm. What do you feel about that?
Um, well, when you said it sounds awful, I mean, I felt like it was a little gimmicky, a little labor intensive, just a, a kind of, I don't know, it seemed like it might be a bit annoying.
I don't
Um,
think it would work for me at all.
how come? Why not?
Um, because the reason I get anxious at night, if I do get anxious at night, is because there's a feeling behind, there's like an emotion attached to it. There's some kind of a, for me, anxiety is tied to a lack of stability, maybe in my life or something like that. And so if I tried to focus on something arbitrary, I know that I've tried something like this before. My brain just keeps going back to like the next topic of what's going to happen here.
Yeah.
So for me, it's more CBT type things, like focusing on that lack of instability in some area of my life and telling myself, reframing what the narrative is, because we go to the worst case scenario
Yeah.
naturally.
Yeah. Okay. So
Like,
getting some addressing cognitive distortions
yeah,
and getting corrective thoughts, all that CBT, good stuff.
right.
CBT, not CBD, folks. CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy, where we're looking at our thoughts and behaviors and trying to be intentional about using certain thoughts and behaviors when maladaptive patterns come up. Um, but today is about understanding what is going on that is making us anxious and miserable at the brain level. And Andre, as you know, this is one of my favorite topics to discuss,
Definitely is.
is the default mode network. This is a network of areas in our brain that light up anytime our brain doesn't have something better to focus on, something that's more neurologically interesting. If we're in the flow with an activity, typically our brain is not in this default mode. It's just the background project. It's like, oh, nothing else to do. And our brain decides to recapture this cognitive energy and deploy it towards making us miserable. And this is not some, idea. This was discovered by watching the brain on fMRI machines and asking people what they are thinking and feeling as different parts of the brain lit up. And what we found was that, when we're on task and in the flow, this part isn't lighting up. When we're just kind of like hanging out, nothing much to focus on, nothing to do. This is often at night when we're going to bed. We finally turn off our screens, we lie down, our brain just turns on and starts ruminating and worrying, right? That's what it's supposed to do. This is by design. It's like we're making a list of our, greatest troublesome, threatening, worrisome things and just cycling through them. Not not to solve it, not to use our executive functioning skills to break the problem down into some, reasonable parts and make some, good decisions about how to manage it. Not that. We're just going to wallow in it. We're going to get our nervous system dysregulated, get our alarm system kicked in so we're kind of in this fight or flight mode with some weird sort of brain process that seems like it's trying to survive whatever it is that's threatening. So we get ourselves dysregulated to get into fight or flight mode to try to survive the threat.
The perceived threat.
Yes, that's the problem. It's because it's not a physical threat. It's psychological, theoretical distress.
Circumstantial.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so why would the brain be designed, like, just out of curiosity, why do you think the brain is designed this way? And do you think this is always how humans have been, or something has influenced it to become more like this?
These are excellent, excellent questions. So if the brain developed this way, it's for some evolutionary benefit.
Right.
But our brain hasn't changed that much in the last, couple thousand years, right? So if we were to look at how the world functioned up until very recently,
Right.
there was less stuff,
Stimulation.
less weird content, less overstimulation that would just kind of get us to this sort of like anxious, overthinking checklist of things to do, right? Like if we're back in like, early tribal situations, which is, kind of where the human brain developed, we're not sitting around with like all the modern day anxiety around money and career and social
Who am
stuff.
I going to be, and where do I fit, and
Right.
all of
Like
that.
back in the day, you might, if you're like in a farming community, you might never go more than like 20, 30 miles from the place of birth. You might see the same 50, 75 people your whole life and not have to continually encounter new people, social anxiety, that kind of stuff, because it's all very familiar. The routines were very familiar. Being outside, moving our body tends to be something that is very synchronizing,
The
embodied.
tasks made sense back then.
Right, right. And often with us sort of being disassociated, disembodied, desynchronized by the screens in front of us, by all this technology that's kind of distracting us from a more kind of centered, embodied state, it's much easier to get dysregulated. So I would imagine that back in the day, this default mode network was doing a useful purpose, which is, hey, nothing to worry about right now. So I'm going to go think about all these theoretical worries, all these possible threats that might be coming up, and just make sure that, everything's okay. But there
Yeah.
wasn't the same kind of mega list of all these distressing things that we can trip out about as there is in our modern society. And I think too, and if we think about it in terms of things like going to bed at night, we were in touch with our circadian rhythms back in the day. So when it came time to go to sleep, when the sun went down, our body was very used to going to sleep around the same time, waking up around the same time, having things like, melatonin as a naturally occurring chemical in our body comes on for a short period of time to help us get to sleep at the right moment in our circadian rhythms when the rest of our body and mind are like preparing for a deep dive into that first round of deep sleep, which does some important restorative processes for our brain and body. But when we're desynchronized from that kind of schedule, from like the sun's clock and having that regular rhythm, which most of us are, right? Artificial light has done a lot to, mess with our circadian rhythms. So our body doesn't really know when it's supposed to kick in. And if it changes from day to day, it's not going to be able to have this nice, like, oh, here's the time for melatonin and everything's kind of shutting down just like clockwork. And then we go
Yeah.
into deep sleep. That's
So
not,
all of our systems are offline or not working properly in this day and age,
yeah,
essentially.
yes. So oftentimes the default mode network is going to kick in when we don't have a specific thing that we're in rhythm with. So the three classic times for people are end of the night,
Hmm.
first thing in the morning, and during a transition in the day where you're going from doing something to just this kind of open-ended, well, now what? Right? We like sort of finish our work for the day, we get home, and it's like, hmm, what now? And our phone is conveniently there to click on, which is a good distraction, right? We can escape from our default mode if we have something that's distracting and interesting. And the phones work very hard at being distracting and interesting.
They sure do.
We can also deprive ourselves in the morning from the natural boost that we would get from waking up in the morning if we're in sync with our circadian rhythms, getting the sunlight, having this sort of like sense that it's time to go do something life affirming. We were wired to have this like time to get up and go energy. So life affirming back in the day would be, I don't know, gathering food, building a hut, like just
That
something
made
useful.
sense to the
Stuff
people
yeah,
that were doing it. And it,
right?
and it gave it was a reward system that it would activate the reward system because you're helping yourself, you're helping your family, you're helping your village, your people. Nowadays, we get up and we're kind of lost. We don't know what we're doing. Even going to work, even if you do have a job
Right.
and it pays well, it could still feel meaningless to you. Or you're going to school and you're doing the work at school, but it's like this isn't even something I care about, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the worst thing we can do is just grab our phone and start clicking on it because then instead of doing something life affirming, we do something that kind of hacks that reward system where we're checking out our likes on social media or we're collecting virtual coins in some game that we're playing where our lizard brain thinks, oh, I've accomplished something. I've actually like gotten out of the gate in my day and done something. But in fact, we've just, done nothing useful in our life and just sort of clicked on this stuff and put ourselves in this weird sort of zombie state where now we've like spent a half hour on our phone in the morning. We haven't really accomplished anything and we've lost the natural benefit that our body and mind gets at the beginning of the day to get out there and go and like take care of something.
This makes me think about the blue zone study. Have you heard of this? Like the blue zones around the world?
Where people live to be 100?
Yeah, and they have like really good mental health. They have like higher life expectancy and all this stuff.
Huh.
They report being happier too. One of the things that all of these zones had in common was they had something embedded in their culture that was like waking up with some sort of meaning or purpose. Like
Mm.
it was like a saying, that, we're waking up with a meaning and a purpose every day. And I feel like our culture doesn't really breed that.
No.
And because we don't have a sense of meaning and purpose, I think anxiety definitely breeds from that, you know?
Yeah.
It's the breeding ground for anxiety to not know where you're supposed to be, what you're supposed to do, why you're doing what you're doing. Um, and I think that, a lot of people who struggle with meaning and purpose, I don't blame them. This is a tough society to figure out who you are in because it's endless amount of possibilities, but it's all oriented around like this idea of success and making money. And, it's not really, it's very individualistic. It's not very interdependent. And
Yeah.
these zones all are interdependent.
Yeah. And I think our society also, um, through screens, creates a lot of symbolic meaning from our virtual persona. And we often are relating through that instead of having authentic connection. So what to do, right? Because the problem with the default mode is that it makes us anxious in a way that is not providing any kind of side benefit. It's a mistake to get our nervous system going on psychological threats, right? To get into fight or flight mode that actually shuts down the blood and oxygen supply that's normally flowing to our brain so it can go to our muscles. So now we're kind of incapacitated to cognitively handle the psychological distress that we created with our cognitions, right? We can't actually, work through the situation using some good skills until we've kind of, chilled ourselves out. So, in terms of what to do, the the theory is, um, it's got a few important principles. One is we're not going to be good at figuring out what to do once we're already anxious. We have to
True.
like workshop this. We have to take some time to recognize the patterns and the ways that we get ourselves off track and to have a plan of what we want to be doing in those moments to get ourselves back on track. And there's a lot of different ideas out there, right? You can Google like top 50 ways to, you know, deal with our anxiety or to ward off a panic attack or things to do when we're just, feeling anxious or bored. And there's going to be a lot of options. We don't need a ton. We just need a few things that we've practiced so that it gets into our muscle memory, so to speak, or our neurological wiring that, oh, when I do this thing, I'm going to calm down. Because I know that idea that we talked about in the beginning of like, oh, think of a piano, blah, blah, blah. Right. And we're both like, that sucks. But I promise you, if you do that 15 times over the next 15 evenings, by the 15th time, it's going to actually have a little bit of legs to it, right? You'll be getting more of a benefit from it through that repetition. It's a signal to our brain like, hey, time to settle down, time to relax, we're going to bed. So we want to not only know what we're going to do, but have practiced it, ideally in scenarios that aren't like a 5 alarm anxiety fire, right? Low level stuff where we're just slightly annoyed to kind of build the skill like we would build a muscle, right? Like reducing anxiety, tolerating distress is a skill. It's not something that we're just born with and either have it or we don't. It's something that if we are intentional about and we practice and we know what we're trying to accomplish in those moments and we're aware of it, we can make a big difference.
What do you think are some like major factors between people who are super anxious and people who can handle their anxiety?
Ooh, well, once we've been kind of in a chronically stressed situation, it does start to change our brain, right? It grows our amygdala in our brain, which is the alarm portion, and the hippocampus, which is the part that it's kind of a relay system. It's like once the signals pass through the alarm system and it says, "Hey, no threat," then am I? It might be the hypothalamus. I'm not sure. I I was
One of
confident when I said
the
hippocampus,
spots.
but regardless, what ends up happening in that relay system is that it sends it to the right part of the brain to be processed. And if we are chronically anxious, that relay system actually starts to shrink in size in our brain as the amygdala is growing in size. There's a mindfulness-based stress reduction technique that has been studied in this regard, where if people use this relaxation technique, and there's tons of them, it's just that this one happened to be studied, but right, they use this regularly for 3 weeks, you actually can see growth at the level of like that hypothalamus, hippocampus. I'm going to get it right eventually. I got to Google that to find out what it is. But beyond that, you're going to see the amygdala shrink.
Right.
And that's really important because it means it's getting less activity.
So it's about the wiring, really. It's about the wiring over time. And if people find themselves in a stress circumstance for a long period of time, it can rewire their brain actually physically. Like we can have a portion of our brain that shrinks that's in charge of regulating fear and difficult emotions, and then the portion of our brain that uh, you know fires off the alarms enlarges, like physically, like we can actually see that change.
Um,
You look
it's
at it.
yeah, hypothalamus it is. Hypothalamus it is.
I'm
Uh,
pretty sure the hippocampus is the front, right?
yeah, I mean they're both kind of involved in this sort of regulation, but the hippocampus has more to do with memory, learning, emotion, whereas the hypothalamus um, is more about processing these different emotions and anxiety and behaviors on a deeper level. Is that right? Is that right? It's yeah. Um, yeah. The hypothalamus is much more about emotions, and the hippocampus is more about memories.
Okay.
Um, but back to what to do in these situations. So if we have a technique and a strategy and we've practiced it, that'll work pretty well. We want to have a couple, right? It might be good to be like, okay, I'm going to journal, but sometimes we don't have our journal. It might be good to have a little sort of progressive relaxation technique that we use, or we get on Headspace. At night, I know a lot of people who will listen to the same music or the same podcast, or I like to listen to stand-up comedy, and that is a trigger for the brain over time that like, okay, it's time for bed. I'll listen to the same stand-up comedy routines over and over and over again. And my brain just knows, oh, I'm listening to this. It's time to go to sleep. But it provides enough content for our mind so that it doesn't go, hey, there's nothing going on. Time to switch gears and focus on my list of things that I find anxiety producing and threatening. If we don't have a distraction or a relaxation strategy,
We're just going to operate off of what's being wired.
yeah, and that's going to be painful. And this is the root of adult addictions.
Mm.
Anxiety, adult depression are coming along as this part of the brain comes online, which, by the way, happens during adolescence, right? A 7-year-old is not going through this. A 3-year-old is not going through this. But as we get into our adult brain, this part starts to get activated. It's having more activity going on, and it just continues throughout our adult life. If we've learned strategies to help ourselves in those situations, it tends to be kind of a nice, efficient system. And so you'll see, like from your question before, of like, some people that are just really anxious versus some that are calm. It's about how we work with these emotions when they come up, in addition to how, our environments is in terms of it being overstimulating, anxiety producing, traumatizing, right? It's like somebody who's gotten PTSD from, a difficult growing up experience or being in a war situation. They are not gonna, it's not all about just like, oh, well, just handle all these things in a very calm way and everything's fine, right? You've got to like really, really do some extensive work. And I would say, with PTSD situations, get some expert help on what strategies you can use to be able to navigate through that, because the escapes to alcohol or other substances as a temporary relief of that pain is very compelling. And I've seen kids, ninth grade or sometimes even younger, trying to explain to their parents how, oh, I just feel kind of anxious and depressed. And the only thing that ever makes me feel better is when I smoke weed.
Right.
Right. And
Yeah.
and that may be the insight that they've gotten from limited understanding and awareness of tools that they can be using to manage anxiety or depression, to manage what is now changing in their brain, right? Because at a younger age, this stuff wouldn't be happening. So it starts to happen more. They get more distressed. There's no strategies from earlier in life to deal with this. And you look around in adolescence, it's like, well, what are people doing? They're like, experimenting with these substances. Well, maybe that's what I should do too.
What would you say is like the number one technique or form of therapy you've used that really helps people with anxiety?
Well, I'm a brain-based cognitive behavioral therapist. At the end of the day, um, I I really believe in having strategies, cognitive behavioral strategies that are based on our understanding of the brain.
Yeah.
And to me, CBT is all about recognizing patterns in your life that we don't like, right?
Mhm.
Things that are distressing. I mean, it could just be patterns like, I want to motivate to exercise more. It could, but whatever it is we want to change, we want to recognize it and then just start brainstorming different things that we could do, different thoughts or behaviors that we could bring to those situations, either proactively or reactively, to try to get a different result. So we come up with a plan. We have an intention, we come up with a plan, and then we try to execute the plan, and then we troubleshoot it. And that kind of systematic way of approaching things that are challenging in our life, I think has a far reaching impact, right? There's a lot of different situations where that can be useful for people. And we can kind of become our own therapist, so to speak, if we take the time to actually like look at what's going on, be gentle with ourselves, try some stuff out, practice the things that we're trying, and see the results. Now, it's great to have intentional ways and times of the week that we look at that, whether it's journaling, going to see a therapist, just taking time at the end of the night to just reflect on things in a sort of systematic way. Um, and we're gonna spend the rest of this month, right, the next 4 weeks, going over this in much more detail. So we're just kind of getting out of the gate now. I know we got to wrap this podcast up in a minute, but we're going to come back with our personal take on it in the next one. So before we wrap, what do you think? What's been the sort of most important strategy for you, or what do you want to say to kind of wrap up the beginning of this journey into anxiety?
I mean, I use CBT as well, and I use the knowledge I have about the brain as well. But I wanted to add to that, a lot of what's going on for us is it is cognitive distortions when anxiety is coming up, right? It's our narratives about ourselves and the world. Um, it's a lot of things that we feel somehow if we think and think and think about it, we'll have some more control over it. And coming to understand where your limits are in life, like where your control ends in life, can really like some form of radical acceptance, right? Can really alleviate anxiety over time. Realizing that most of the world feels, the same way when they're out of control. And it's okay that you're feeling this way. And I don't know who said it, but someone said, we spent most of our life worrying about things that never happen. And
Mm.
you know, the evidence is there. A lot of times we're worrying about things that never actually come to fruition. We might feel like we're going to fail a class, but we end up passing it. We might feel like we're going to get in trouble for something, but we don't, right? Or we are going to lose the job, or we're not going to be good enough for a partner, or whatever it is. Um, these are all distortions. When you actually look at reality, most of the time these things aren't going to happen.
Good points. But we're coming up against time.
Okay, let's keep it moving.
So we got to wrap here. Like and subscribe. Here's our outro.
Therapy dudes, take away your stress, put you in a good mood. If you had them over, they would eat up all your food. It's time for therapy dudes. Therapy dudes, take away your stress, put you in a good mood. Listen to them anytime you're coming unglued. Time for therapy dudes. Time for therapy. Time for therapy.
That song just never gets dull.